keep in mind that 50 years ago, we didn't know any of this for all practical purposes, or very little of this. And keep in mind that we're so close to this revolution that we don't really understand its ramifications. I imagine it will be another 50 years before we really begin to appreciate the fallout, the long-term consequences of this revolution in biology which began 51 years ago. And so you're part of that, and you're going to experience it much more than my generation did. And indeed, one of the reasons why MIT decided about 10 or 12 years ago that every MIT undergraduate needed to have at least one semester of biology is that biology, in the same way as physics and chemistry and math, has become an integral part of every educated person's knowledge base in terms of their ability to deal with the world in a rational way. In terms of public policy, in terms of all kinds of ethical issues, they need to understand what's really going on. Many of the issues that one talks about today about bioethics are articulated by people who haven't the vaguest idea about what we're talking about this semester. You will know much more than they will, and hopefully sometime down the road, when you become more and more influential voices in society, you'll be able to contribute what you understood here, what you learned here, to that discussion. Right now, much of bioethical discussion is fueled by people who haven't the vaguest idea what a ribosome or mitochondrion or even a gene is, and therefore is often a discussion of mutually shared ignorance, which you can diffuse by learning some basics, by learning some of the essentials. Here's the complexity of the cell we're going to focus on largely this semester, which is to say the eukaryotic rather than the prokaryotic cell. And this is just to give you a feeling for the overall dimensions of the cell and refer to many of the landmarks that will repeatedly be brought up during the course of the semester. Here's the nucleus. The term karyon comes from the Greek, meaning a seed or a kernel, and the nucleus is what gives the eukaryotic cell its name. Within the nucleus, although not shown here, are the chromosomes, which carry DNA. You may have learned that a long time ago. Outside of the nucleus is this entire vast array of organelles that goes from the nuclear membrane, and I'm pointing to it right here, all the way out to the outside of the cell. The outside limiting membrane, the outer membrane of the cell, is called the plasma membrane. And between the nucleus and the plasma membrane, there is an enormous amount of biological and biochemical activity taking place. Here are, for example, the mitochondria. And the mitochondria, as one has learned, are the sources of energy production in the cell. And therefore, we'll touch on them very briefly. This is an artist's conception of what a mitochondrion looks like. Almost always, artists' conceptions of these things have only a vague resemblance to the reality. But in any case, you can begin to get a feeling for what one thinks about their appearance. Here are mitochondria sliced open by the hand of the artist. And interestingly, mitochondria have their own DNA in them. One now accepts the fact that mitochondria are the descendants of bacteria, which insinuated themselves into the cytoplasms of larger cells roughly 1.5 billion years ago, and began to do a specialized job, which increasingly became the job of energy production within cells. To this day, mitochondria retain some vestigial attributes of the bacterial ancestors which initially colonized or parasitized the cytoplasm of the cell. When I say parasitized, you might imagine that the mitochondria are taking advantage of the cell, but in fact the mitochondria represent the essential sources of energy production in the cell. Without our mitochondria, as you might learn by taking cyanide, for example, you don't live for very many minutes. And the vestiges of bacterial origins of mitochondria are still apparent in the fact that mitochondria still have their own DNA molecule, their own chromosome. They still have their own ribosomes and protein synthetic apparatus, even though the vast majority of the proteins inside mitochondria are imported from the cytoplasm, i.e. these vestigial bacteria now rely on proteins coming in made by the cell at large that are imported into the mitochondrion to supplement the small number of vestigial bacterial proteins which are still made here inside the mitochondrion and used for essential functions in energy production. Here's the Golgi apparatus, and the Golgi apparatus up here is used for the production of membranes. As one will learn throughout the semester, the membranes of a cell are in constant flux and are being pulled in and remodeled and regenerated. The Golgi apparatus is very important for that. Here's the rough endoplasmic reticulum. That's important for the synthesis of proteins, which are going to be displayed on the surface of cells. You don't see them depicted here, or are going to be secreted into the extracellular space. Here are the ribosomes, which I might have mentioned briefly before, and these ribosomes are the factories where proteins are made. Again, we're going to talk a lot about them. And finally, several other aspects, the cytoskeleton. The physical integrity, the architecture of the cell is maintained by a complex network of proteins, which together are considered to be the cytoskeleton, and they enable the cell to have some rigidity, to resist tensile forces, and actually to move. Cells can actually move from one place to the other. They have motile properties. They're able to move from one location to another. The process of cell motility, if that's a word you'd like to learn. Here's what a prokaryotic cell looks like by contrast. And I just want to give you a feeling. First of all, it looks roughly like a mitochondrion that I discussed before. But you see that there's the absence of a nuclear membrane. There's the absence of the highly complex cytoarchitecture. Cyto always refers to cells. There's the absence of the complex cytoarchitecture that one associates with eukaryotic cells. In fact, all that a bacterium has is this area in the middle. It's called the nucleoid, a term which you also will probably never hear in your lifetime, and it represents simply an aggregate of the DNA, of the chromosomes of the bacterium. And in most bacteria, the DNA consists of only a single molecule of DNA, which is responsible for carrying the genetic information of the bacteria. There's no membrane around this nucleoid, and outside of this area where the DNA is kept are largely ribosomes, which are important for protein synthesis. There's a membrane on the outside of this called the plasma membrane, very similar to the plasma membrane of eukaryotic cells. And outside of that is a meshwork that's called the outer membrane. It's sometimes called the cell wall of the bacterium, which is simply there to impart structural rigidity to the bacterium, making sure that it doesn't explode and holding it together. And then there are other versions of eukaryotic cells. Here's what a plant cell looks like. And it's almost identical to the cells in our body, except for two major features. For one thing, it has chloroplasts in it, which are also, one believes now, the vestiges of parasitic bacteria that invaded into the cytoplasm of eukaryotic cells. So in addition to mitochondria, which are responsible for energy production in all eukaryotic cells, we have here the chloroplasts, which are responsible for harvesting light and converting it into energy in plant cells. The rest of the cytoplasm of a plant cell looks pretty much the same. One feature that I didn't really mention when I talked about an animal cell is in the middle of the nucleus, here you can see, is a structure called a nucleolus. And a nucleolus, or the nucleolus in a eukaryotic cell, is responsible for making the large number of ribosomes which are exported from the nucleus into the cytoplasm. And as I mentioned just before, the ribosomes are responsible for protein synthesis. It turns out this is a major synthetic effort on the part of most cells. Cells like our own have between 5 and 10 million ribosomes in the cytoplasm. So it's an enormous amount of biomass in the cytoplasm whose sole function is to synthesize proteins.